What happens if Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz? A global oil shock explained. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that one tiny stretch of water has brought the entire global economy to its knees. It's barely 30 miles wide. It's bordered by just 2 countries. And yet, every day, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply flows through it. This is the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most important oil choke point. And if Iran ever blocked it, the shockwaves wouldn't just ripple across the Middle East. They would shatter energy markets, fuel prices, and geopolitical stability around the globe. Most people rarely think about the path their gasoline takes before it reaches a pump, or how Asia powers its factories, homes, and transport networks. But if the Strait of Hormuz were shut down, every consumer, every business, and every nation that relies on imported oil would suddenly feel the heat. That's because this narrow channel between Iran and Oman links the Persian Gulf, home to some of the world's largest oil producers, with open oceans and global markets. From Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait to Iraq, nearly 20 million barrels per day of crude and fuel products pass through these waters. What would happen if Iran actually blocked this passage? Before answering that, we need to understand why such a scenario is even on the table. Iran has repeatedly threatened to take this step when tensions escalate, particularly with the United States and its allies. In recent years, heightened conflict, including US and Israeli strikes against Iranian targets, has led Tehran's parliament to approve motions to close the strait if attacked. These threats aren't just political posturing. They're a reminder of the leverage Tehran holds over global energy flows. But leverage is only effective if it's credible. So let's imagine this shocking scenario becoming reality. On day one, as news breaks that Iran has initiated a blockade, whether by laying naval mines, firing missiles at commercial tankers, or stationing warships, markets would react instantly. Traders would panic. Oil prices, currently much lower than in past decades, could spike dramatically in a matter of hours. Analysts from major financial institutions have warned that crude prices could rise above $110, even $120 or $150 per barrel if the strait were blocked for even a short time. To put that in perspective, a surge like this would rival or exceed the oil shocks of the 1970s and 1990s. Pump prices would climb, energy bills would balloon, and inflation, already a concern in many economies, could sprint out of control. Industries that depend on petroleum, manufacturing, transportation, agriculture would see their costs skyrocket as energy became scarce and expensive. Companies would respond by raising the prices of goods and services, deepening the inflationary spiral. While the initial shock would be felt most acutely in oil markets, the broader economic effects would ripple outward. Shipping companies would face higher insurance premiums, especially if insurers label the strait as a war risk zone. Some vessels might avoid the region entirely, forcing longer, more expensive routes around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. This would delay deliveries of not just oil, but raw materials and manufactured goods, further straining global supply chains already stressed from earlier crises. Energy importing nations like Japan, South Korea, China, India, and much of Europe would feel the consequences especially hard. These economies rely on steady imports of oil and liquefied natural gas, much of which currently transits Hormuz. In a worst-case scenario, shortages could force governments to implement rationing or tap into strategic petroleum reserves. But reserves can only soften the blow temporarily. They can't replace sustained flows of energy from the Gulf. It's crucial to understand that the chaos wouldn't be limited to oil alone. Natural gas markets would also be disrupted, especially liquefied natural gas exports that depend on the same corridor. Countries in Europe and Asia already vulnerable to energy shortages could see power prices spike just when they need energy most, during winter heating months or summer cooling peaks. The result could be blackouts, industrial shutdowns, and social unrest. Political repercussions would follow swiftly. Major powers, especially the United States, European Union members, and regional players like Saudi Arabia, would face immense pressure to respond. The US Navy's Fifth Fleet, based nearby, is specifically tasked with maintaining freedom of navigation through this waterway. In past crises, the US has intervened to protect shipping lanes. A blockade would almost certainly prompt a military response aimed at reopening Hormuz, a gambit that could escalate tensions into full-scale conflict. But this isn't just about big navies and oil tankers. The global economy is interconnected in ways most people don't think about. Higher energy costs would feed into food prices, because fertilizers and agricultural fuels require oil and gas. Transportation costs for every delivered good would go up. Central banks might be forced to raise interest rates to fight inflation, but higher rates could slow economic growth or even trigger recessions. The ripple effects would be felt in stock markets, bond markets, and even currencies. For ordinary consumers, the impact would be personal and immediate. Imagine paying significantly more at the gas pump, for home heating, or for everyday goods transported around the world. Higher energy costs often hit lower-income households hardest because they spend a larger share of their income on fuel and utilities. In countries without generous social safety nets, this could lead to protests, political instability, and even changes in government. Even countries that export their own oil wouldn't be immune. Some Middle Eastern producers would lose revenue because their exports would be disrupted, just like everyone else's. And Iran itself, despite using the blockade as a potential weapon, would be severely harmed. Its economy depends on oil exports, and cutting off its own shipments would shut down much of its revenue base, potentially alienating allies like China that rely on Iranian oil. For this reason, most analysts consider it unlikely that Iran would sustain a full blockade for long. Still, even a short-lived disruption would send shockwaves. Oil prices don't react only to actual changes in supply, they react to fear and uncertainty. Just the threat of closure has pushed prices higher in the past. Recent geopolitical tension in the region, including military exercises and political escalation, has already triggered volatility in oil markets, pushing benchmarks to multi-month highs as traders price in risk. So if Iran were to act on threats and block the Strait of Hormuz, the world would face an energy crisis unlike anything seen in decades. Prices could soar, economies could slow, and governments would be forced to make tough political and military decisions. The question wouldn't just be about who controls one narrow waterway, it would be about how resilient the global economy really is when its most critical lifelines are threatened. But let's be clear, while such a blockade would be dramatic and destabilizing, it's not the most likely outcome. Closing the strait would be a form of economic self-harm for Iran, hurting its own exports and risking a military confrontation with far more powerful adversaries. Experts believe that although Iran may use the threat to gain leverage or extract concessions, a full closure remains a last resort option, one with far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Still, the mere possibility of such an action highlights how interconnected and fragile global energy markets are. A conflict thousands of miles away could suddenly touch every nation, every household, every economy, simply because so much of the world's energy flows through a narrow channel between two countries. In the end, the story of the Strait of Hormuz is not just about oil. It's about power, leverage, and how vulnerable the global economy can become when key supply routes are threatened. And while the world watches diplomats, generals, and analysts debate the next move in the Middle East, ordinary people need to understand that the stakes are not abstract, they are real, and they could hit us all where it matters most, in our wallets, our jobs, and our everyday lives. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more deep global explainers.